At 2:15 in the morning, maintenance worker Dan Rodriguez was making his routine check of the Park Street subway tracks when he heard screaming from the platform above. A woman in an expensive black suit had fallen onto the electrified rails, her Hermes bag scattered, papers flying everywhere. Without hesitation, Dan jumped down to pull her to safety. As he helped her up, a leather notebook fell from her coat pocket, opening to reveal complex engineering diagrams and handwritten notes reading Energy Efficiency Protocol, version 3.2. The woman, Alexandra Sterling, stared at Dan with confusion, as if something didn't add up about this simple maintenance worker. She caught sight of one more detail on the notebook's cover, "For Emma's Future," written in careful script. Alexandra couldn't shake one nagging question. How does a subway maintenance guy draw blueprints like these? Brookhaven, Massachusetts was the kind of suburban town where everyone knew their neighbors, and the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, trains ran like clockwork through its heart. December 2024 had brought one of the harshest winters in recent memory, with snow piling up against the small rental houses that lined Maple Street. Dan Rodriguez lived in one of these houses, a modest two-bedroom that cost him $1,200 a month, sharing it with his 9-year-old daughter, Emma. His navy blue maintenance uniform hung on the bedroom door next to a small framed photo of his late wife, Sarah, who had passed from cancer 2 years earlier. Every morning at 7:30, Dan would walk Emma to Brookhaven Elementary before heading home to catch a few hours of sleep. His work shift started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m., maintaining the underground railway system that connected their small town to Boston. The job paid $42,000 a year, enough to cover rent, groceries, and Emma's school supplies, but not much else. Dan's work boots were worn brown leather, his pencil always tucked behind his right ear, and his lunchbox contained the same peanut butter sandwich he'd packed for the past 18 months. What the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority didn't know was that Dan Rodriguez had once been Daniel Rodriguez, a graduate of MIT with a master's degree in electrical engineering. He'd worked on the preliminary designs for Boston's next-generation subway system before Sarah's diagnosis changed everything. The medical bills had eaten through their savings, and after Sarah died, Dan found he couldn't return to his old life. Working maintenance kept him close to the trains he'd once designed, but without the pressure of deadlines and corporate meetings. Emma was the bright spot in his quiet existence. She had her mother's curiosity and her father's analytical mind, often asking questions about how subway systems worked, while Dan helped her with homework. On weekends, they'd walk to the local diner, where Emma would order chocolate chip pancakes and Dan would drink coffee that cost 99 cents a cup. It was a simple life, but it was theirs, and Dan had convinced himself it was enough. The woman he'd pulled from the tracks that December night was about to change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. Alexandra Sterling was in Boston for 3 days, negotiating a $500 million contract that would determine the future of urban transportation systems across the eastern United States. She was staying at the Four Seasons, drove a Tesla Model S, and wore Armani suits that cost more than Dan's monthly salary. But as she stood on that platform, brushing snow from her coat and staring at the notebook in Dan's hands, she realized she might have just met the most important person in her professional life. Alexandra handed Dan a business card with elegant silver lettering, though she kept her company name deliberately vague. "I'd like to check on your health tomorrow," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that could have been from the cold or from something else entirely. Dan nodded, tucking the card into his uniform pocket, and watched as she disappeared into the early morning darkness. He had no idea that Alexandra Sterling had just spent the last 6 months searching for exactly the kind of breakthrough innovation that was apparently tucked inside a maintenance worker's notebook. The next evening, Alexandra found herself returning to Park Street Station at 11:30 p.m., telling herself she was conducting research for her upcoming presentation. She'd changed from her usual business attire into dark jeans and a wool coat, trying to blend in with the few late-night commuters who moved through the underground passages. When Dan arrived for his shift, he seemed genuinely surprised to see her again, but his smile was warm and welcoming. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, and Alexandra realized she'd been holding her breath. "I wanted to understand how the system works," she said, which was partly true. Dan's face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm she rarely saw in corporate boardrooms. He began explaining the intricacies of signal management, electrical grid efficiency, and passenger flow optimization, using technical terminology that made Alexandra's pulse quicken. This wasn't the vocabulary of a typical maintenance worker. Dan's hands moved with precision as he pointed out specific components, his explanations revealing a depth of knowledge that seemed almost impossible given his current position. When a signal monitoring device malfunctioned during their impromptu tour, Dan fixed it in less than 10 minutes, using a bypass technique that Alexandra recognized from advanced engineering textbooks. She watched him work, noting how his movements were methodical and confident, like someone who had spent years designing rather than just maintaining these systems. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked, but Dan just shrugged and said he'd picked up a few things over the years. They sat on a bench in the empty station, sharing coffee from Dan's thermos. Alexandra found herself drinking instant coffee that cost 99 cents, and surprisingly, it didn't taste terrible. Dan talked about the city at night, how he could see the whole transportation network from certain vantage points, and how he sometimes thought about ways to make it run more efficiently. His voice carried a wistfulness that suggested he was remembering something rather than imagining it. "The best view is from the maintenance walkway above Track 7, Dan said, leading her to a spot where the entire underground junction was visible. "From here, you can see how everything connects. Sometimes I think about how the whole system could be redesigned to save energy and reduce delays." Alexandra listened carefully, realizing that Dan's casual observations contained insights that had eluded some of the best transportation engineers she'd worked with. As the night progressed, Alexandra found herself sharing details about her own work, though she kept things deliberately vague. She mentioned being involved in design consulting and having clients who were interested in transportation efficiency. Dan seemed content with her explanations, just as she was apparently content with his story about being a maintenance worker who'd always been interested in how things work. But there was something in his eyes when he talked about the subway system, a familiarity that went beyond casual interest. When their shift ended at 7 a.m., Dan walked Alexandra to the station exit. The December sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the platform. "Same time tomorrow?" Dan asked, and Alexandra found herself nodding before she'd consciously made the decision. As she walked toward her Tesla, she couldn't shake the feeling that Dan Rodriguez was hiding something significant, just as she was hiding her own identity from him. The next morning, Alexandra made a decision that would have surprised her business associates. Instead of heading straight back to her hotel, she followed Dan at a distance, curious about where a maintenance worker lived and what his life looked like outside the subway tunnels. She watched him stop at a small grocery store, where he carefully counted out bills and coins to pay for a sandwich that cost $2.99, along with a carton of milk for what she assumed was his breakfast. As Dan was leaving the store, a young girl with dark hair and bright eyes came running up to him. "Dad, you forgot to give me lunch money," she said, and Alexandra realized this must be Emma. The girl was articulate and confident, speaking with a vocabulary that seemed advanced for her age. Dan immediately started searching his pockets for additional cash, and Alexandra could see him mentally calculating whether he had enough to cover both his breakfast and Emma's lunch. "Emma, this is Alexandra," Dan said when he noticed her approach. "She's been interested in learning about how trains work." Emma's eyes lit up with excitement. "Dad's been teaching me about electrical systems and energy efficiency," she said. "Did you know that if you optimize the power distribution curves, you can reduce energy consumption by up to 30%? Alexandra blinked in surprise. This was not the kind of conversation she expected to have with a 9-year-old. Dan's face flushed slightly. "Emma's always been curious about my work," he said, but Alexandra could see there was more to it than that. No maintenance worker taught their child about power distribution curves unless they had a much deeper understanding of engineering principles than Dan had admitted. She excused herself and walked back to her car, but not before noting the address on the small house where Dan and Emma headed. That evening, Alexandra found herself parked across the street from Dan's rental house, telling herself she was just trying to understand the complete picture. Through the living room window, she could see bookshelves lined with technical manuals and engineering textbooks. On the wall, barely visible from her angle, was what appeared to be a framed diploma. Dan was sitting at a small kitchen table, helping Emma with what looked like a complex mathematics problem, drawing diagrams that looked suspiciously like circuit schematics. When Dan appeared at his front door 20 minutes later, Alexandra realized she'd been caught. "Are you following me?" he asked, his voice carrying a mixture of concern and curiosity rather than anger. Alexandra felt her carefully constructed story beginning to crumble. "I was just curious about that notebook from the other night," she said, which was the truth, even if it wasn't the complete truth. Dan studied her face for a long moment, then made a decision that would change both their lives. "You're not just interested in how trains work, are you?" he said. "And I'm guessing you're not a design consultant either." Alexandra felt her heart rate increase. "What makes you say that?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dan opened the leather notebook, revealing pages covered with detailed technical drawings, mathematical calculations, and engineering specifications. Each page was signed D. Rodriguez and S. Rodriguez in careful handwriting. "My wife Sarah was a systems architect," Dan said quietly. "We worked on this project together before she got sick. She wanted to create a transportation system that would be safer and more efficient for Emma to grow up with." Alexandra stared at the drawings, her mind racing. These weren't just theoretical designs. They were detailed implementation plans for a revolutionary subway system that could transform urban transportation. The energy efficiency protocols, the safety redundancies, the passenger flow optimization, everything she'd been looking for was contained in this notebook. "Dan," she said slowly, "do you realize what this is worth?" "It's worth everything to me," Dan replied, misunderstanding her question. "It's all I have left of Sarah's work, and it's Emma's inheritance." Alexandra felt something twist in her chest. She'd been searching for breakthrough technology to win a $500 million contract, and she'd found it in the hands of a widowed father who had no idea he was sitting on a potential $100 million innovation. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Park Street Station. Richard Sterling, a tall man in an expensive coat, was waiting for Dan when he arrived for his shift. "Hello, Daniel," Richard said, emphasizing the formal name. "It's been a long time." Dan's face went pale. "Richard? What are you doing here?" "I heard through the MIT alumni network that you've been working on Sarah's old project," Richard said. "My company is very interested in acquiring those designs. We're prepared to offer $2 million for the complete technical specifications." Alexandra, who had been approaching the station entrance, stopped in her tracks. Richard Sterling was the Chief Technology Officer of Transsystem Dynamics, her primary competitor for the Boston contract. "I know you've been struggling financially since Sarah passed," Richard continued. "This money would set Emma up for life. You could move out of that rental house, send her to private school, start over somewhere new." Dan's hands clenched around the notebook. "Sarah's work isn't for sale," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Think about it, Daniel," Richard said. "You're working a maintenance job that pays $42,000 a year. Emma deserves better than that. Sarah would want you to do what's best for your daughter." With that, Richard handed Dan a business card and walked away, leaving Dan standing alone on the platform, staring at the notebook that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Alexandra waited until Richard was gone before approaching Dan. "I heard what he said," she admitted, "and I need to tell you something." Dan looked up at her, and she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "I'm not a design consultant," Alexandra said. "I'm the CEO of System Flow Architecture. We're bidding on the same contract that Richard's company wants." "So you've been lying to me, too," Dan said, and Alexandra could hear the disappointment in his voice. "You came here looking for the notebook, just like him." The accusation hung between them like a physical barrier. "At first, yes," Alexandra admitted. "But then I got to know you and Emma, and I realized this isn't just about business anymore." Dan closed the notebook and held it out to her. "Take it," he said. "If you're going to use Sarah's work to get rich, you might as well be the one to do it." At least you pretended to care about me as a person. Alexandra stared at the notebook, then pushed it back toward him. I don't want it, she said. Not like this. But you need it to win your contract, Dan said. And I need the money for Emma's future. Maybe we can both get what we want. Alexandra shook her head. What I want is to understand why a brilliant MIT engineer is working a maintenance job and living in a $1,200 rental house. What I want is to know why you're hiding your talents instead of using them to change the world. Dan's composure finally cracked. Because I can't handle the pressure anymore, he said. Because every time I sit in a conference room or look at a design board, I think about how I was working on transit systems while Sarah was dying. Because I failed her when she needed me most, and I can't fail Emma too. The words came out in a rush, years of guilt and pain finally finding their voice. Sarah wouldn't want you to bury your talents, Alexandra said softly. She'd want you to use them to build the future she dreamed of. Dan looked at her with eyes that held too much sorrow for someone his age. How do you know what Sarah would want? He asked. You never even met her. Alexandra took a deep breath, knowing she was about to reveal something that would change everything. Actually, I did know Sarah, she said. Not personally, but professionally. Sarah Rodriguez was legendary in the systems architecture community. Her work on integrated transportation networks was groundbreaking. I've been following her research for years. Dan stared at her in shock. You knew about Sarah's work before you met me? Alexandra nodded. When I saw that notebook, I recognized her design signature immediately. Sarah Rodriguez and Daniel Rodriguez were the most innovative engineering team of their generation. The fact that you've continued her work, Dan, this isn't just valuable technology. This is Sarah's legacy. The weight of this revelation settled between them. Dan had been protecting Sarah's work like a precious secret, never realizing that the broader engineering community had been hoping for years that someone would continue her research. So what happens now? Dan asked. You take the designs, win your contract, and I go back to my maintenance job. What happens now is that you stop hiding, Alexandra said. What happens now is that you honor Sarah's memory by finishing what she started. What happens now is that Emma gets to see her father use his gifts to change the world. Dan looked down at the notebook, then back at Alexandra. And what about you? What do you get out of this? Before Alexandra could answer, Emma appeared at the top of the station stairs, looking worried. Dad, you didn't come home, she said. I was scared something happened to you. Dan immediately went to his daughter, wrapping her in a hug. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I was just talking with Alexandra about some work stuff. Emma looked between her father and Alexandra, then at the notebook in Dan's hands. Is that Mom's book? She asked quietly. Dan nodded. Dad, why don't you ever show people Mom's drawings? They're really beautiful. Out of the mouths of babes, Alexandra thought. Even Emma could see that Dan was wasting his talents. Emma, what would you think if Dad went back to being an engineer? Alexandra asked. Emma's face lit up. Could he design trains like Mom did? Could he help make them safer for everyone? Alexandra looked at Dan. Yes, he could do exactly that. 2 days later, Dan Rodriguez walked into the maintenance office and submitted his resignation. His supervisor was surprised but understanding, especially when Dan explained that he'd been offered a position as a consulting engineer. What Dan didn't mention was that the position came with a 50% stake in a new transportation design firm that Alexandra was starting specifically to develop Sarah's innovations. The partnership contract was unlike anything either of them had signed before. Dan would retain ownership of all designs originated by Sarah Rodriguez, while Alexandra would provide the business infrastructure and capital needed to bring those designs to market. Any profits would be split equally, with Emma Rodriguez named as the primary beneficiary of Dan's share. But the most important clause in their agreement had nothing to do with money. Alexandra had insisted that the company be named Rodriguez Sterling Transportation Solutions, ensuring that Sarah's name would be permanently associated with the innovations they brought to the world. Dan had initially protested, saying he didn't deserve to have his name connected to Sarah's legacy. But Alexandra had been firm. "You're not just honoring Sarah's memory," she'd said. "You're completing her work." The first project for Rodriguez Sterling Transportation Solutions was, appropriately, the Boston subway system upgrade. With Dan's technical expertise and Alexandra's business connections, they were able to present a proposal that revolutionized everything the city had been considering. The energy efficiency protocols alone would save the city $50 million annually, while the safety improvements would reduce accidents by 90%. 6 months later, Dan Rodriguez stood in a conference room at City Hall, wearing his first business suit in 3 years, presenting the final implementation plan for the Boston transportation upgrade. Emma sat in the back of the room, beaming with pride as her father explained how the new system would make trains safer, faster, and more environmentally friendly. But the real breakthrough came when other cities began requesting presentations. The Rodriguez Sterling system was so innovative that transportation authorities from New York to Los Angeles wanted to implement similar upgrades. Within a year, the total value of contracts using Sarah's original designs exceeded $100 million. Emma Rodriguez was 10 years old when she received her first royalty check for $100,000, deposited into a trust fund that would ensure her education through graduate school. Dan had initially wanted to refuse the money, saying he was just finishing work that Sarah had started. But Alexandra had convinced him that Emma deserved to benefit from her parents' innovations. On a warm spring evening, 18 months after their first meeting, Dan and Alexandra sat on the same bench, where they'd shared instant coffee and talked about subway systems. Emma was at the other end of the platform, sketching her own transportation designs in a new notebook that looked remarkably similar to her mother's original. "Do you think Sarah would be proud?" Dan asked, watching his daughter work. Alexandra smiled. "I think Sarah would be amazed that her husband finally stopped hiding his talents." Dan laughed, the sound echoing through the empty station. "And I think she'd be impressed that a hard-nosed CEO learned to drink 99-cent coffee." "Actually," Alexandra said, "I've developed a taste for it. There's something honest about instant coffee that $5 lattes don't have." Dan looked at her with surprise. "You're not the same person who fell onto these tracks 2 years ago, are you?" Alexandra considered the question seriously. "No, I'm not. That person was so focused on winning contracts that she almost missed the most important discovery of her career." She gestured toward Emma, who was now showing her drawings to a security guard who'd stopped to chat. "And I don't just mean the technical innovations." "What do you mean?" Dan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Alexandra stood up and walked to where Emma was excitedly explaining her latest design for a solar-powered train car. "I mean, I discovered that the best partnerships aren't just about business," she said. "They're about building something that matters." 6 months later, Rodriguez Sterling Transportation Solutions announced their next major project, a nationwide network of high-speed rail systems that would connect major cities while reducing carbon emissions by 60%. The announcement was made at a press conference where Dan Rodriguez, now recognized as one of the leading transportation engineers in the country, stood beside Alexandra Sterling, his business partner and closest friend. In the audience, Emma Rodriguez sat next to her father's old notebook, now displayed in a place of honor at the company headquarters. The notebook was open to a page where Sarah had written, "For Emma's future," in her careful script. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added, "Built by Dan, Alexandra, and Emma Rodriguez Sterling, 2026. The little girl who had once asked her father about power distribution curves was now 12 years old and designing her own transportation innovations. She had her mother's analytical mind, her father's engineering instincts, and a new understanding that the best solutions came from people who cared about each other as much as they cared about their work. As the press conference ended and reporters began filing out, Dan Rodriguez looked around the room at everything he and Alexandra had built together. 2 years ago, he'd been a maintenance worker hiding from his past and limiting his future. Now he was part of a company that was changing how millions of people traveled, creating jobs, and building the kind of sustainable transportation network that Sarah had dreamed of. "No regrets?" Alexandra asked, joining him at the back of the room. Dan smiled, watching Emma discuss her latest designs with a group of engineering students who'd attended the press conference. "Only one," he said. "I wish Sarah could see this." "She can," Alexandra said, pointing to Emma's notebook. "Every time Emma writes in that book, every time we implement one of Sarah's innovations, every time you teach a young engineer about sustainable design, Sarah sees all of it." Dan nodded, understanding that some legacies lived on not in monuments or memorial plaques, but in the work that continued long after the original dreamer was gone. The Rodriguez-Sterling Company went on to transform transportation systems across North America, creating jobs, reducing environmental impact, and making travel safer for millions of people. Emma Rodriguez-Sterling became the youngest person ever admitted to MIT's graduate engineering program, where she continued developing the innovations that her parents had started. But perhaps the most important transformation was the one that happened in a small house in Brookhaven, Massachusetts, where Dan Rodriguez learned that honoring the past sometimes meant embracing the future, and where Alexandra Sterling discovered that the most valuable things in life couldn't be measured in dollars or contracts, but in the connections we make and the dreams we build together.